You know, I've been following video game industry discourse for a very long time, about as far back as when the game industry first began to use the term AAA to describe itself, which I would say started around 2005, 2006-ish. Now, it's not like this was a new term at the time, but it was when the video game industry started to use it as a stamp of quality, a marketing term that meant, hey, this video game is bigger and better than anything you've seen before. And it's important to note that this was around the reveal and launch of systems like the Xbox 360, Nintendo Wii, and later the PlayStation 3. 3D games had already been around for multiple generations, but now graphics engines were getting more advanced and games were looking better than ever, and game publishers wanted you to know that the industry was really progressing along, which, I mean, they wouldn't have had to do were they not so insecure about it. The only reason publishers started using the term was because they were terrified that consumers wouldn't really see a big upgrade between the consoles they already had and the new latest and greatest thing. An insecurity that has, of course, only gotten worse with each successive generation, as the differences become less and less apparent. It also doesn't help that AAA is just a meaningless and bullshit term anyway, as we've come to discover over the years. What it actually means is this game cost a lot of money to make, in excess of $50 million, going into the hundreds and nowadays even exceeding $1 billion. Obscene, ludicrous, and inconceivable amounts of money to the average person. AAA has never been a stamp of quality, and in fact, these publishers have only hamstrung themselves in their own propaganda effort by habitually lying to customers about the quality of these games and practically ensuring that they never meet the expectations they set for themselves, whether it's by doctoring up the visuals of a game for a reveal trailer, or straight up lying about game systems and pretending they're so much deeper or grander than what's shown on screen, by elaborating on the skill of their game worlds while conveniently never mentioning what a player can actually do in them. The best example of this lie is and always will be, to me, the original Watch Dogs. While it is by no means the biggest letdown nor the biggest failure, it just perfectly embodies everything about what was and still is wrong with this industry. As an introduction to the next generation, this game was supposed to be so many magnitudes more than what it actually was, with rich and interesting systems and this extremely malleable world with true-to-life NPCs and incredible visuals, and just none of it was true. In fact, if you were to take the final game in that series, Watch Dogs Legion, which released nearly 7 years later, even that game would not be able to match and meet the bar that was set for the first game, because that's the nature of AAA. That's what it is and always has been. I would even go so far as to say that maybe 10% of the time, a AAA game actually meets or exceeds its own hype. And sure, there are games that fall under this label that are incredible. The best games of their own generation, in fact. But with how many of these giant piles of money that could feed entire countries with their exorbitant budgets come out every year, you would think that we could count on more than the fingers on one hand the number that actually end up being worth that $60 or $70 asking price. And that doesn't even include the DLC and microtransactions and deluxe editions and everything in between. Of course, none of this is what today's video is about. I just want to be very clear with you what I mean when I say AAA throughout today's video, because that clear delineation is important. This is not an indie problem. This is not a AA problem. Hell, if anything, I only want to show my support for those sorts of games at a time like this. But this is a soapbox I've been on and off of for the better part of 5 years now, and I'm not about to pretend I'm blameless myself. I'm not such an idealist that I have never pre-ordered or even paid full price for a AAA video game in that time frame. I've even allowed myself to get hyped for games here and there. I'm a human as much as everyone else. But with what's happened over the past couple of weeks, I mean, come on, this has really been going on for a couple of years now, I think we're experiencing sort of a watershed moment in the game industry. What happened on May 7th was very eye-opening for a lot of people, as Microsoft shut down both Arkane Austin, makers of Prey and Redfall, and Tango Gameworks, makers of The Evil Within, Ghostwire Tokyo, and most notably, Hi-Fi Rush. That last game in particular has been central to the discourse going on the past several days, as it was a total critical darling, and just about everybody who played it loved it. People seem less surprised about Arkane Austin because Redfall is kind of infamously terrible, but Prey, on the other hand, while it was definitely criticized when it came out as not being really all that faithful to the original series and was more or less just dishonored in space, it is still a very beloved game by those who did actually give it a chance and play it. In fact, it has since come out that Arkane Austin wanted nothing to do with Redfall, and it was really all on the shoulders of ZeniMax, who forced them to make this trend-chasing live service. Of course, Microsoft would go on to acquire ZeniMax and all of its subsidiaries in the middle of Redfall's development, and so they were sort of saddled with the project, as the cost of the game was already past sunk at that point. Even Microsoft admitted they didn't expect the game to be a success. But the point is that none of this is Arkane Austin's fault. And while they certainly had a lot of talent leave long before the release of Redfall due to the whole situation, this is still a great studio that was recklessly destroyed in a manner very reminiscent of the dozens of victims of EA's past studio shutdowns, such as Visceral, Westwood, Danger Close, Black Box, Maxis, Bullfrog, just to name a few. Now, to anyone who's actually been following the industry, none of this is new. I think everyone saw the writing on the wall after the disaster that was Redfall, but even more so when Microsoft claimed that they were committed to the game's long-term success rather than just letting Arkane Austin move on to something they actually wanted to make. But Tango Gameworks? Well, I gotta be honest, while I wasn't expecting it, I didn't think they were particularly less likely to fall victim than many of the other studios that have gone the same way these past couple of years. In case you haven't noticed, this is a problem that has been plaguing the industry for a long time, and it's kind of the hot new thing, and everyone is doing it. Last year should have been pretty eye-opening, I think, as games like Baldur's Gate 3, Alan Wake 2, Final Fantasy 16, Marvel Spider-Man 2, and The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom all set the world on fire. It was an incredible year for AAA games, possibly the best the industry has had in a very long time, and yet more than 10,000 people were laid off over the course of that year. Even to go back to Tango Gameworks, while Hi-Fi Rush was absolutely a beloved game and a success from a critical standpoint, there is no way of knowing if it was a commercial success because all of its numbers were hidden behind Game Pass. This is something that Microsoft is notorious for. They tend to only trot out the sales numbers of a game when it's actually a success, and if they don't want to do that, then they just say, oh, well, it sold well on Game Pass, because that system has been kind of ruining the numbers game around the video game industry for the past several years now. All of this is stuff you've probably heard before from bigger and more learned and more journalistic channels than I. Of that, I have no doubt. And it's so easy to take a doomer stance on this topic, to be so cynical and jaded and trot out the old no ethical consumption under capitalism line. Because, yeah, it sucks. It's such a bummer to see this shit go down and all his talent bled away and the art suffer as a result. I singled out Microsoft before, but honestly, there is nobody better than this. Sony has been on a tear of their own lately, trying to start this futile war with the PC crowd, as if that's going to work, but more than anything, displaying a patented Sony-esque arrogance that only they are capable of, and that has always been their biggest downfall, because only a cocky, self-important asshole could launch a brand new console at $600 in 2006 and think that's okay. And that's a nearly $900 when adjusted for inflation, by the way. Sony has always thought so high and mighty of itself and only groveled at the feet of its audience when it saw an opportunity. The golden opportunity, as many people have said in the past. The PS4 and Xbox One console launch was the console launch to win, and Sony did. They picked exactly one moment to be extremely consumer friendly. And in retrospect, they really weren't even that. They just weren't total assholes to their customer base like Xbox was intent on being, because apparently that's a lot to ask for. And Sony has settled right back in their old ways ever since, resting on the knowledge that Microsoft will never catch them again, and Nintendo doesn't even view them as competition. They're so full of themselves because they've won the virtual monopoly. And they too are out closing down studios, doubling down on the business model that everyone has been sick of for years in live services, and generally being asinine about their business decisions because their leash is still hundreds of miles long. And I'm not actually going to go on a rant about Nintendo because, well, it's not like they don't deserve it, but they've been particularly quiet lately, and generally we all know what they're guilty of being, even if they're kind of doing their own thing. Point is, these past couple of weeks, I think, send a message. A message that has been sent many times by the game industry, but there's something so final about this particular instance. Something so, I think, impossible to ignore. Something that everyone still watching and listening to this video at this point needs to consider and to realize. And I think, as we look back on a year like 2023, and even in the incredible games that we've gotten this year, such as Helldivers 2 and Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, and that's that this isn't an act of defiance. This isn't another disappointment in a long line of them from a volatile and ever-changing industry. This is a blatant, direct, and unmistakable act of complete surrender. Last year, one of the core pieces of discourse surrounding the success of Baldur's Gate 3 was, Why doesn't anyone else try to make games this way? Why is this game succeeding so expertly with the AAA formula where others have been failing even further for decades now? Why was Larian able to come in and flip the entire Western RPG craze on its head and kick the ever-living shit out of the likes of EA, Bethesda, Capcom, Gearbox, and anyone else who's tried it outside of possibly CD Projekt Red? Was it just a flash in the pan? Well, back in January, Larian boss Sven Vincke kind of made a bit of a jab at the industry and its penchant for closures over the past year, saying that you get good games when you retain those good developers who have the experience and the resume one would need to know about how to put a good video game together. That sometimes paying your employees and making sure you hold on to the people that made your successful game good in the first place actually pays off in the end. I'm paraphrasing, of course, but this is the gist of what he said. In a world after the events of this speech, where this definitely made the rounds and it was literally said at an awards show where many of the executives of the exact companies he was putting on blast were sitting in that very audience, the closures of Tango, Gameworks, and Arkane Austin are so much less forgivable. It is an act of malicious capitulation. By doing this, Xbox has heard what Sven Vincke said, has seen the success of a game like Baldur's Gate 3, has seen the success of many other big budget games, and has undoubtedly and unequivocally said, nope, too hard. Sorry, we can't do that. The entire industry is saying this now and has said it time and time again. And from a cold and calculated business standpoint, it actually makes a lot of sense. Making a very good video game can actually be quite stressful because of the expectations it puts on your shoulders. Where is the money in good when you can get by with just good enough? Why give yourself that pressure to deliver when gamers will buy something half as good at the same rate? It's so much easier to make a dozen 7 out of 10 games than it is to make a dozen 9 out of 10 or 10 out of 10 games, because nobody has ever done that before. But the former can also be churned out faster. It's passable, it's acceptable, the turnaround is high, and you make your money back. The AAA industry knows this and has known this for a very long time because they are not in the business of art. They are in the business of exploiting art for money, and always have been. And right now, they are showing you their hand clear as day, and I am begging you, please do not be ignorant to it this time. I'm begging you to see that if you give a shred of fuck about video games and if you want to play good stuff, you should never buy another AAA video game again at full price. Secondhand? Absolutely. Steep discounts? Sure. But this side of the industry does not deserve to exist. It is a lie, it is a trick, and even in the best case scenario, it is hardly more than passable. Now, I'm not some delusional idealist. I know that this is a hardline stance, and every time anything like this is suggested or said, a whole bunch of strawmans rear their heads, or industry apologists find a way to make someone with a take like this look like the bad guy. Oh, so you don't think the developers in this industry deserve to get paid? I see your game, you asshole. You must hate video games. No, you fucking idiot. Don't be that guy. Electronic Arts deserves to shut down. Square Enix deserves to shut down. Ubisoft, above I think everyone else, absolutely deserves to shut down. But the people working there, emphasis on people, of course. I mean, firstly, have you seen the layoffs going around the game industry? None of them are all that safe right now anyway, and if they're going to go down too, well, sink the whole fucking ship, I say. Video games will still get made. They'll still be created. As long as there is a market for it, and as long as there is a passion there to make good video games, they absolutely will always and forever exist. That is not even a question. What I'm saying is, all of the current players have shown their hand. They have spent years revealing their playbook, and I'm saying that the talent in this industry, the real people with real livelihoods and a real passion for art, deserve a much better brand of parasite writing their checks, because a whole lot of it is rotten to the core. And this is all even without getting into the stories of misconduct and workplace abuse and harassment and so much more that's been going on in the game industry for decades now. Because that's not even what I'm here to talk about today, but if I need to bring it up, I will. The point here is not a complex one. AAA, the codified term, the one that the video game industry itself has lived and died by for the better part of 20 years, needs to die. It needs to be buried and forgotten. It is the poison that is killing this hobby and this space for everyone. Set your bullshit culture wars aside for a moment, set the console wars and any and all brands of infighting aside, and look up at the boot that's pressing down on everyone, squeezing out every last cent it can until the world economy well and truly crashes, and everyone on top can pull the lever, drop out of their hatch, and escape in their golden parachutes. This industry has fully and completely conceded to its own greed, and I am begging you, please stop giving into it. I'm not saying do this immediately. I'm not saying cut it out cold turkey, but maybe start the weaning process. Look elsewhere as often as you can, and for the love of God, please stop pre-ordering. This is a tired and old plea that pundits have been making since the start of pre-orders as a concept, but it is still so true. In fact, it's more true than ever. Games don't just run out of stock. You're verifiably never in danger of missing out, outside of delisted games, but that's got nothing to do with pre-orders anyway. And I'm not about to sit here and pretend that I will be able to cut this cold turkey either. I'm still hitched to the Destiny wagon for as long as my friends are willing to play it with me. I'm still looking out for the last bit of the Horizon trilogy or the odd Nintendo game here and there. But I have dedicated a part of myself to be so picky, so discerning, to be so stingy, and to never let myself fall prey to the hype cycle again, to never give in to the AAA bullshit machine, and that's all I ask of anyone else. And besides all of that, there are so many better games out there anyway, from AA to indies to past games and even retro games. There's not a soul on earth who's had the time or the patience to play half of all the greatest video games ever made, let alone the majority of them. So please go explore. The best game you've never played isn't always on the horizon, I promise you. For every good game that might come out later this year, there are dozens that have come out just in the past few years that you've never played. Expand your horizons and don't be the dumbass that AAA publishers take you for. It's your duty to inform yourself if you care about video games and yourself. Especially at this moment in time where video games are more expensive than ever. They certainly are not better than ever. And with the moves like what Microsoft, Sony, Take-Two, Ubisoft, Embracer, EA, Capcom, Square Enix, and Warner Brothers are all making as of late, that won't be changing anytime soon. I'll see you in the next one.